video, I'm discussing how, from a systems perspective, helps us understand what market and policy factors drive the housing market. In other words, what are the key things that drive housing market change? And also recognize that when the system produces outcomes, that they may have a significant effect on the economy. I am going to focus on the economy both as a driver of housing systems and housing system changes, but also emphasize the recursive effects back from housing outcomes onto the economy. I had made some reference in the introductory video that we've done in this series that many of the outcomes that are created by the housing system have not just an importance in terms of Canadian society, but in the environment and the economy as well. And I think that whether one's talking about a neighbourhood scale, metropolitan scale, or indeed the provincial and federal scales, the economic dimensions of housing systems are not dealt with very well in policy development and formulation. And I'll try and justify that position as I make this case. So I think in the introductory video, I stressed that because housing is spatially fixed, and I'm sorry about the economics terminology, once you put houses in the ground, you can't move them. So it's spatially fixed as capital investment, unless, of course, we're in the world of tents or mobile homes, which we aren't, at least primarily. In this case, housing is fixed spatial investment. And that means it's always located somewhere. So it's part inherently of a spatial or a geographic system. It's fixed in place. So housing's always local, but it's always more than local. And that's really important because the policy discourse in Canada emphasizes the local without thinking about the wider systems, whether it's neighbourhood, whether it's region, whether it's nation, whether it's global, that drive housing change, and whether the feedbacks from the outcomes, in a sense, also reach these different spatial scales. And I think it's very important that we begin to think in these terms, because the shift, the emphasis in terms of governance, you can no longer reach the conclusion, I think, in this millennium, that housing is primarily a social outcome, a social program, and that's best dealt with at provincial or local scales. I think that housing has drivers that reach from the global to the local and consequences too. And if you're going to govern that system effectively, you have to grasp that and you have to develop the governance arrangements that deal with that. So, okay, let's just take a step back from that conclusion. I have a bad habit of presenting conclusions in the introduction, but that's an important conclusion. So that we take the point that a house is fixed in place. It's always local. We also know it's fixed in a neighbourhood. You can't buy or rent or be allocated a home in a neighbourhood separately. They are joint goods, if you like, so that housing may actually help shape neighbourhoods that are more or less conducive to or impacted by economic development. For instance, Richard Florida's discussion about the creative class and bohemian neighbourhoods, or when we talk about the housing that supports innovative clusters in the cities, there are distinctive housing types, there are distinctive housing tenures, and distinctive housing arrangements that facilitate that economic development through that neighbourhood scale of change. So that matters. And we also know, of course, the converse is true, that when we have rundown neighbourhoods, the old problem of inner city decline, have households that are poor concentrated within them, that particularly kids, when they're teenagers, there's a whole set of neighbourhood effects that may affect their transition out of school and into work, and how they might progress in the labour market. So that these are all dimensions of housing systems that play up in economic development programs that are quite often actually not taken account of. better taken account of at neighbourhood scales than some other scales. Equally, if we look at the big metropolitan economies, and the three biggest metropolitan economies in Canada are half the economy, so these effects are important. Clearly, mismatches between housing locations and labour markets and employment affect whether or not agglomeration economies are productive or not, and I'll come back to that. They affect things like commuting distances, costs, and the spatial structure of the economy. Mostly housing policy doesn't think about that. And certainly the way we've constructed housing policy as social policy concentrates in dimensions other than these. Going beyond the metropolitan scale, clearly all these effects of housing outcomes and effects on housing prices and availability and the extent to which high housing prices generate high mortgage to income ratios and so on, they end up clearly with very significant national scale effects. And there may well also be global processes going on in housing systems that are contained within national areas. There's been a lot of focus in Canada about international migration, particularly Chinese migration to Canada. I think that that effect is somewhat overstated in both policy discussion and indeed policy. I'm happy to elaborate on that later. But we also know that if we take the big world cities, and Toronto and Vancouver would be on cusp or in that category, there has been some convergence, particularly after the 1990s through to recent 2 or 3 recent years. There has been some convergence across these major global cities like Sydney in Australia, London, Paris, and so on, that have slightly detached these big metropolitan areas from their national housing systems. So if you're trying to control housing policy by macroeconomic, say monetary policy, to any significant extent, that's going to be problematic when some part of the the country is marching to a different rhythm that's driven globally rather than by regional and local factors, which are, of course, extremely important for the majority of settings. So we have to think about all these spatial scales, not only in terms of where drivers come from, but where outputs and their impacts actually go to. In other words, housing outcomes, and I stress again and again, they're not just social, they're not just local, and they are often economic. I want to take the housing market as part of the economy to develop a number of themes. And the first of these is that when we look at economic evidence about how housing markets in Canada change, they really do confirm to us that this is a system. It's not just geographic segments determined by formal boundaries laid down by administrative principles or whatever. There are real functioning interacting systems out there. And housing markets have geographies that can be more or less useful in achieving our national objectives. There's a couple of ways that economists look at this. For instance, if housing markets are well connected and smoothly adjusting, we tend to get price convergence. In other words, you can have a house price boom in Vancouver, but over time, there will be adjustment of resources and resource flows, whereby that boom may be abated, but also people may move, and it may also have some outflows that have impacts on prices in other localities. At least that's the theory. Doesn't always work that way. But if one looks at patterns of price change across regions and within metropolitan areas, they tell us much about the structure of the economy, the structure of the housing system, and whether it's operating as a relatively unitary, well-balanced system. And I would have to say, I actually think that research on the spatial economy of the Canadian housing system lags way behind Australia and the UK. And interestingly, although there's data, it's not really used to do a lot of econometric work on this topic. But certainly the broad suggestion is that there are big structures that are out of balance, that get into balance, but certainly the structures are there. We can also, in a sense, these price effects take place because households move. or demand shifts, if you like, at least in a geographic sense. And I think that recent changes in the patterns of flows in Canadian housing markets are actually really important to look at. The first of all would be that within metropolitan regions, I'm just going to focus on the big metros today simply because we need to keep this short. Within the big metropolitan areas, there has been a steady suburbanization. Although city centres have recovered from the point when there was inner city decline, it's still the case that metropolitan areas as a whole are growing faster than other spatial forms in the Canadian economy. That's because the suburbs, and particularly the outer suburbs, have been growing particularly rapidly. Now, that has implications both for how effectively labour markets function and has huge implications for carbon greenhouse gas emissions that I'll talk about in the next video. We know that suburbs are growing, inner cities have recovered, and we also know that the flows of people within these metropolitan areas specialised. David Holchansky has done a historic piece of work looking at Toronto, about how three different Torontos have emerged over the last 30, 40 years as people sort and sift themselves into different geographies within the Toronto metropolitan area. And I think that we'd find pretty similar patterns or at least we would find structures in other metropolitan areas if we looked for that. I think that much has been made of the race for space during COVID, which has meant suburbanization, with suburban house prices growing faster than city cores. That seems to be now balancing out somewhat with city cores recovering, at least in residential terms. But also it was manifested, and this makes a point about the system, in a significant uptick in flows of people out of major metropolitan areas into more rural, attractive rural and small town Canada. In other words, there are very clear connections of systems. I pointed out before COVID, and I'll emphasize again, that tendency has been running now for 10 to 15 years. If you look at all the counties in Nova Scotia, all bar one, have increased their population since 2016, and that has been partly about people with affordability challenges in relation to the lifestyles they want, having to leave big cities and deciding that, particularly with new technologies in terms of being able to work in different ways, that they're going to relocate to, in that particular case, smaller town or rural Nova Scotia. And what you then see is, because these are relatively small housing systems with sticky supplies, as well as the bigger metropolitan areas, you very rapidly get the spread of affordability issues out of the big metros and into the smaller rural communities. And in 2022, where I live in Nova Scotia, house prices were rising as fast as the big metropolitan cores. So that, and I know this has happened in many parts of Canada. So that this really emphasizes the importance of thinking about Canada as a system of lots of local systems, and within that, flows of people and changes in prices and flows of capital underpin that spatial system that we have to work in, so that there are limits to the extent to which the autonomies that exist at local scales from municipalities and provinces can deal with what are really Canada-wide processes. I think that these are important things, but we also know, and the rural spread is really important. But I think all evidence points to Canada being pretty central in the OECD camp, that really over the next 30 years, metropolitan growth is going to dominate all kinds of other growth. And in that context, there's going to be a faster flow of established Canadians, in a sense, leaving major metropolitan areas, potentially taking equity with them, particularly able to relocate to suburbs and more dispersed parts of Canada and be replaced to a significant extent by new Canadians who will be, in a sense, looking for affordable housing, because they will tend to, as I come back to later, go to what are the major metropolitan areas. So all of these changes that we see and what's driving these housing markets and the spatial patterns of them, it reflects the market. Doesn't really reflect housing policy very much, simply at the margin, but it reflects the impact of other policies that are really significant. For instance, if one was to understand what had happened or what's happening to rental housing markets in metropolitan core areas and indeed other parts of Canada, one would have to look at patterns of immigration, volumes of immigration, which have increased really significantly. And be very clear, I think that Canada's immigration strategy makes good sense for the country and the economy and the society. I have a concern about the extent to which the ability of the housing system to absorb that without difficulty has not been adequately addressed, so that a lot of housing outcomes are going to be driven not by what's in the housing minister's portfolio, but in the immigration minister's portfolio. Similarly, if one wanted to look at rental housing markets, the number of overseas students in Canada has risen from about 100,000 at the start of this millennium to about 675,000 this year. Well, that's 550,000 additional spaces in rental housing systems, particularly when universities have not invested very much in housing the client group they now make large amounts of money from. As a university professor, that's a very dangerous comment to make, but it's highly accurate. I think that in that context, we're also seeing decisions that are taken in completely different fields other than housing that actually pressurize rental housing markets in our major metropolitan areas. We also know issues that are taken, policy decisions that are taken about sustainability, about whether or not to have a spatial economic policy, and I'll come back to some of the issues about monetary policy and prudential regulation policy. These are huge drivers of demand for rental housing in Canada and affect it much more than the instruments and, if you like, capacities to resolve some of the issues that lie within the portfolio of the housing minister. So we have to change our thinking about what housing policy really is. It's not, or the policies that affect housing outcomes are not how we've conventionally conceived of housing policy. And it's these sets of policies and the processes they touch upon that make this such a wicked problem. The way of looking at housing policy from the past and the way in which its structure of governance is determined really relates to the concerns of 1950 to 1990 and does not address what are the key and acute issues about housing systems in Canada in the present time. And taking a systems approach really brings that out. I'm not suggesting we in any way diminish a commitment to meeting housing needs, not at all, nor that we don't need more rights, more resources. We do. We need all these things, but we need a much better integrated understanding of what's driving the systems and take into account the policy consequences of not dealing with these systems. So then, let's move on from questions about structure and things that drive the housing economy and its importance in the housing system. When we look at the housing problems that there are in Canada, and indeed the other countries, we have different views about what's going on here. The standard view at the moment is it's a supply side problem. Well, economics always is a supply side problem. That is in part the economic problem. What people are meaning is there's a shortage problem. In other words, what we're dealing with either rising housing prices or people paying too much for rents or people unable to enter the housing system. It's a reflection of shortage. And that shortage is a balance of supply and demand in the market, the sector, the tenure, the place that people are looking for. Now, that imbalance is partly driven by demand. Going back to the previous section of the video, if immigration policy was different, if overseas students policy was different, if policies about spatial dispersion of employment were different, then the structure of demand would be different and we wouldn't have the same immediate housing pressures. We might lose a lot of other benefits. I'm not suggesting in any way, as I suggested, reducing immigration or higher education or whatever, but we have to, in a sense, address what it does. So we can also, in a sense, look at whether or not fiscal policy exaggerates the demand for housing in Canada, and it does. It increases because housing capital gains are untaxed. It increases, in effect, in the long run, the asset demand to hold housing more than it would otherwise be the case. So these are issues that need to be confronted. So it's not just a supply side problem, but it is importantly a supply side problem. And you can see these supply side issues being particularly important just now, not just because the construction industry is pretty near full capacity and, in a sense, still being faced by issues about shortage. But of course, we're going to have a leap in immigration and other numbers that are going to drive demand up to a very significant amount. And at the same time, as we'll discuss next time, we're going to be running into major issues of refurbishing the existing housing stock to make it energy efficient. And people that estimate that we really need a construction sector maybe double to 3 times the size of what we already have may well be right if we want to achieve these objectives and maintain relatively stable prices. So some important trade-offs need to be looked at in that particular context. Now, given that I mentioned the supply side, I would emphasize that the supply side in housing, there are strongly ideological views about this. There are some very good recent work by the Bank of Canada research staff that show quite detailed responsiveness of different metropolitan housing markets, a really useful policy tool. And I think that it was never the apparatus of housing policy, which spends a lot of time looking at housing needs and housing demand. But at a local and a national level, nobody ever audits supply side capability of the housing systems that people are going to be, in a sense, embedded into. And that shows, in a sense, the bias of thinking in the way that we've done housing policies. The notion that the housing supply shortages are largely just created by either lazy or willfully bad municipal planning or the inability of metropolitan or provinces to allocate strategic land for housing. They may well apply in some places and sometimes. They're not necessarily a universal phenomena. And certainly in many jurisdictions in recent years, it's been shortage of construction labour, shortage of materials, and the absence of infrastructure that is able to allow developers to convert a development permission into a sellable project have all been really significant issues. So we've got to recognize that in the connection to the economy, the supply side connection is really important. We have to get a grip of that in Canada and actually look at, try and understand why North European economies like Norway and Sweden with very similar climatic conditions have flexibility of housing supply that's double that of Canada. And I think, so we can't make climate entirely the excuse. There's a whole set of other issues, including propensity to use modular construction. I think that in terms of moving on here, and I'm taking rather too long, I would suggest that what I'm really saying here is because we have whole sets of demand influences driven by policy drivers that aren't in the Housing Ministry portfolio, and because we haven't thought coherently about the supply side, we actually don't have coherent market system strategies. We don't have them at metropolitan scales and local scales, so we can't have them at the national level. And if we're saying that since the 90s, we increasingly rely on the market system to deliver our key housing outcomes, we should be relatively unsurprised that some of these outcomes are rather dysfunctional and don't meet the policy outputs that we would really want. In other words, we have a national housing strategy, but we don't have a national housing market strategy. And I think that that's an important difference. And the absence of the latter really confounds the existence of the former. So if we're looking at housing and housing outcomes, if you're in government, what key outcomes in the economy are influenced by housing market outcomes? The most obvious one, and the one that the Government of Canada and the Bank of Canada have given very substantial attention to, particularly since the global financial crisis, are that if house prices fluctuate up and down, there are questions about the stability of the economy. If the economy is fluctuating up and down, there's also the question of whether investing in housing can quickly, through multiplier effects, create jobs and in construction, incomes that are used in the community, and generally help stabilize the wider economy. I think that that issue is reasonably well explored. I think the question of financial stability and the effects of OFSI, for instance, in mortgage, really testing whether or not people can sustain mortgages so that the financial system might be secure, has been important. And obviously the benefits of system stability are apparent at the present. So also are the problems, given the extent to which younger households have been rationed out into home ownership, are probably exacerbating rental sector demand or exacerbating continuing demands to live with their parents. And I think that that may be a good thing, but may also not be what individuals actually want. So stability. Do our housing markets operate in a way that's relatively stable? And what are the costs, in a sense, of altering policy, which comes out, again, this lies outside the portfolio of the housing minister. So how well are these decisions about stress testing mortgages and indeed taking decisions about monetary policy, how well are they researched? How well are they established? Do we know what the local consequences of macro changes in interest rates and monetary policy might well be? And do we take that into account in the decision? So that's an important question. In other words, at that stability level, I think that there's a case for establishing the extent to which monetary policy, fiscal policy, and supply side policy are actually coherently governed at the federal level, more so than the other levels. So how do we do that, and can we actually do it better? Second sets of strands for housing outcomes, and I'm not going to spend time on this at all, although it's really important, is because housing is the most widely held asset by ordinary Canadians, and because housing costs are such a big share of overall household spending, shifts in housing prices and rents have a huge impact on the distribution of income and wealth. And in this millennium, housing wealth changes have become more regressive than they were historically. It's also the case that for most Canadians in the last 10, 15 years, their wealth has been increased more by uplifts in their housing values than by what they earned at work. And generally, that may be a sign of not a very good economic model where, and here the Scottish economist comes to the fore, people earn more by lying on their beds sleeping, as John Stuart Mill observed, as opposed to out there having ideas, being entrepreneurs, being effective labour supply, and so on. I mean, that's a really big issue. And also in the present cost of living crisis that people have, the rising rent burdens that particularly lower income households face mean that the residual distribution of income after housing costs has become much more regressive than it was 10 years ago. So that these are big issues. If we think about Canadian economy not just to be stable, but to have a reasonable distributional outcomes, and Canadians have always been renowned as caring about that, the housing system is actually making that much more difficult than is often recognised. And finally, I want to turn to the last issue, which is virtually ignored in housing policy and in economic policy. And that is the effect of housing outcomes on productivity and growth. We have to think of housing in two ways when we think about it in the economy. There's the activities that relate to housing, designing it, building it, selling it, maintaining it, whatever one do. If you like, housing as a verb or adverb. Many of these activities are actually quite low productivity. The average productivity of labour in the housing industry is less than the national average. So if you expand the housing sector as part of economic strategy, you actually temporarily lower overall labour productivity. Raising productivity in these sectors is, I think, an important question. We never look at the question of productivity in the real estate sales sector. In the Canadian context, such work has been done in the US, in the UK, and Australia. But I think these are relatively minor considerations in relation to the question about not so much the verb dimensions of housing, but the noun. Housing produces a complicated structure. We talked about that in the first video, of systems and structures which provide comfort, they provide space, they provide accessibility to the neighbourhood, to work, to play, and so on. In other words, all these attributes of a house or a dwelling are used with other household resources and household time to produce services for the household that influence their capabilities. If your kids don't have space to learn at home, and this was particularly obvious in COVID, that houses with inadequate space and badly connected internet, these kids fell behind faster than anybody else's. But that would be true in normal times too. So that attribute of the size of a home and the space of a home is important. We also know that obviously all the questions about accessibility, if younger buyers are forced out to the edge of a metropolitan area, in a sense to make housing affordable because land's cheaper at the edge, but they now have much longer commutes, and the Canadian evidence is that long commutes have increased significantly in the last decade, leaving aside COVID again. But in that context, it's not just the travel to work time that's important. And it's not just transport that resolves that issue, it's housing decisions, but where houses were put relative to where jobs were. That's a housing decision, it's not a transport decision. And in that context, what really matters is there's lots of evidence that shows that if we move people away from core areas of employment, the labour market works less efficiently. Is that happening in Toronto? Is it happening in Montreal? Is it happening in Vancouver? Evidence is it's happening in Australian cities. I suspect it's happening in Canadian cities too. We can think about lots of other examples. If a child, I was talking about if it's an inadequate size and design of house, you learn less well. If it's an unhealthy house, if it's poorly heated, poorly ventilated, or somehow inadequate in terms of inducing health, kids are in poor housing are a year to a year and a half in learning behind peers from more equivalent, from better homes by the age of 5 or 6. that continues through their process. If you live in a poor neighbourhood when you're growing up and you're a teenager, there's a whole range of influences that come into play. When you try to get into work, it might also be much more difficult. So that we can track how housing attributes, housing choice attributes affect labour market performance. They also affect house price increases, and house price gains are quite important as elements of encouraging small firms to individuals to create small firms or expand relatively small ones they've developed. There's quite a bit of emerging literature on how households have used the unearned housing equity that they have to actually do some more productive things. There are mixed results. More or less none of that evidence relates to Canada, because we don't ask these questions. I've yet to see a Canadian city or metropolitan or rural authority that's done a productivity audit of its housing outcomes. In other words, how do they affect productivity? We know that Canada is very concerned about productivity, just simply doesn't see that the largest element of consumer expenditure, the most widely held asset by households, and something that is spatially fixed might just happen to influence household productivity. Of course it is. I've touched on a number of significant themes here about how thinking in a systems perspective and looking at the economy highlights the evidence that Canada is a system of housing subsystems, that they are connected, there are economic flows that are important, there are economic outcomes that are critical not just for individuals, but are critical in achieving the big economic goals of Canada in terms of stability, in terms of fairness of distribution and inclusion, and in terms of productivity and growth. Very few of these arguments ever get deployed in decisions and discussions about housing policy. That has to change. A modern housing policy has to think about what a whole range of policies do to housing, what it then does to the economy, and what the feedback effects are. Next time, we'll look at the environmental effects.